Jim was in the middle of "Touch Me" when he reached for his belt, and the entire Dinner Key Auditorium held its breath. What happened next left 87 people swearing they saw everything, while 200 others insisted he never removed a single piece of clothing. March 1st, 1969. Miami's Dinner Key Auditorium was suffocating with heat and bodies pressed too close together. The doors had already burned through "Backdoor Man," 5 to 1, and "When the Music's Over." 12,000 people screamed for more. But Jim Morrison was drunk, angry, and about to create rock and roll's most controversial mystery. But what none of them knew was that a 22-year-old photography student named Michael Garrett was positioned in the front row, left section, with 3 cameras loaded and ready. He had been hired by the Miami Police Department 2 hours before showtime. His orders were simple: document everything. In the 5th row, center section, sat 19-year-old Linda Patterson. She had driven 6 hours from Georgia alone, running from an arranged marriage her parents had planned for the following week. This concert was her last moment of freedom before a lifetime she didn't choose. She had 48 hours before the wedding. "I needed to see someone refuse to be caged," Linda wrote in a letter she never sent to Morrison. Her father Thomas and her fiancé Robert were already searching for her. The tickets had cost her entire savings. And what she witnessed that night would determine whether she drove back to Georgia or disappeared forever. Before we dive into what really happened in those 17 minutes that changed rock history forever, hit that subscribe button. You're about to hear the truth that took 34 years to emerge from classified FBI files, and you won't believe how this story ends. Morrison had arrived in Miami 3 days earlier, in the worst condition his bandmates had ever seen him. Ray Manzarek would later tell interviewers that Jim spent those 72 hours in a continuous cycle of drinking, passing out, and drinking again, barely eating, barely sleeping, moving through the Carillon Hotel like a ghost haunting his own life. The Miami concert had been added to the tour at the last minute, a favor to a promoter who promised a massive payday, and Morrison had opposed it from the beginning, telling Ray that something felt wrong about Florida, that he had dreamed about fire and handcuffs and cameras, that this show would end badly. Ray dismissed it as alcoholic paranoia. He would spend the rest of his life regretting that dismissal. The night before the concert, Morrison disappeared for 11 hours and returned to the hotel at dawn, wearing different clothes, his knuckles bleeding, refusing to explain where he had been or what had happened. Robbie Krieger found him on the balcony at noon, staring at the ocean, drinking vodka straight from the bottle, muttering about cages and freedom and the price of truth. When Robbie asked if he was okay to perform, Morrison had turned those empty eyes on him and said something that Robbie recorded in his tour diary and would quote in his memoir 40 years later. Morrison said that he was never okay to perform, that every show was a kind of death, that stepping on stage meant killing the part of himself that wanted to be safe and comfortable and normal, and that tonight in Miami he was going to kill that part so completely that it could never come back. The venue was a disaster from the start. Dinner Key Auditorium was a converted seaplane hangar with no air conditioning, metal walls that trapped heat like an oven, and a capacity of 7,000 that the promoters had violated by selling 12,000 tickets. People were crammed shoulder to shoulder, sweating, drinking, passing joints hand to hand in the darkness, the atmosphere thick with marijuana smoke and tension and anticipation. The Doors were 2 hours late taking the stage because Morrison had locked himself in the dressing room and refused to come out until someone brought him a bottle of whiskey, then refused to come out until someone brought him another bottle, then finally emerged at 11:30 at night, so drunk he could barely walk. The opening band had played 3 encores. The crowd was restless, angry, ready to riot. And Morrison stumbled onto that stage like a man walking to his own execution, leather pants hanging low on his hips, no shirt, his chest slick with sweat before he even reached the microphone, his eyes scanning the crowd with something that looked like contempt or despair or both. Ray counted them in with the opening chords of Back Door Man, and Morrison grabbed the microphone stand, leaning into it like he needed its support to remain standing, and began to sing in that deep baritone voice that could make any lyric sound like a threat or a prayer or a confession of murder. The first 3 songs went as well as they could given Morrison's condition. He forgot lyrics, improvised obscenities, insulted the crowd, called them sheep and cowards and slaves to their own fear. But that was standard Morrison behavior by 1969, part of the shamanistic performance that had made him famous and infamous in equal measure. The audience loved it, screaming approval every time he spat another insult, treating his contempt like affection, his aggression like intimacy. But something was building in Morrison during those songs, some pressure or rage or self-destructive impulse that everyone close to the stage could feel, but nobody could name. Between songs, he drank straight from a wine bottle someone had thrown on stage. He stumbled. He caught himself. He stared at the crowd like he was looking through them at something else, something darker, something that terrified and attracted him simultaneously. And then, 17 minutes into the set, during the opening bars of Touch Me, Morrison did something that would destroy his career, spawn 300 police reports, generate 87 sworn testimonies claiming he had committed a felony, and become the most disputed moment in rock and roll history. He reached for his belt. That much everyone agrees on. 87 witnesses, 200 witnesses, every single person in that auditorium saw Morrison's hand move to his belt buckle. What happened next depends entirely on who you ask, where they were standing, how drunk they were, and what they wanted to believe about Jim Morrison. The 87 witnesses in the front sections, the ones closest to the stage, the ones who could see Morrison clearly under the harsh white spotlights, swore under oath that Morrison unbuckled his belt, unbuttoned his leather pants, and exposed himself fully to the crowd for between 3 and 5 seconds before tucking himself back in and continuing the song. They described it in graphic detail. They gave depositions. They testified in court. Some of them were police officers in plain clothes. Some were journalists. Some were parents who had brought their teenage children to the show and were so outraged by what they witnessed that they filed criminal complaints before midnight. Their testimonies were consistent, specific, and damning. They said Morrison was smiling when he did it, that he made eye contact with people in the front row, that he said something obscene before exposing himself, though they disagreed on the exact words. The Miami Police Department built their entire case on these 87 testimonies. But then, there were the other 200. 200 witnesses, many of them in the same sections as the 87, some of them standing within feet of the people who swore they saw Morrison naked, who swore with equal conviction that Morrison never exposed himself, never unbuttoned his pants, never removed a single article of clothing beyond the shirt he had already discarded before taking the stage. These 200 people gave their own depositions, wrote their own letters to the court, testified at preliminary hearings with the same specificity and confidence as the 87 who claimed the opposite. They described Morrison reaching for his belt, fumbling with the buckle, then stopping, pulling his hand away, grabbing the microphone instead. They said the lighting was terrible, that the spotlights created harsh shadows, that it would have been easy to misinterpret Morrison's movements. Some suggested that Morrison had been simulating the act without actually completing it, that he was performing the idea of exposure without the reality. Others claimed that people in the crowd had wanted so badly to see Morrison do something outrageous that they had collectively hallucinated the incident, seeing what they expected to see rather than what actually happened. The defense attorneys latched onto these 200 testimonies and built their case on reasonable doubt, arguing that if 200 sober witnesses could contradict 87 other sober witnesses about something that allegedly happened under bright lights in front of thousands of people, then how could anyone be certain beyond reasonable doubt that a crime had occurred? Michael Garrett, the police photographer in the front row, should have settled the question. He had 3 cameras. He was positioned perfectly. His specific assignment was to document any illegal behavior. But when the police department developed his film rolls 3 days after the concert, looking for the photographic evidence that would make their case unassailable, they found something impossible. Garrett had taken 43 photographs during the 17-minute period in question. 12 of those photographs showed Morrison's hand on his belt. 8 showed Morrison's belt unbuckled. 3 showed Morrison's pants unbuttoned at the top. But not a single photograph showed Morrison exposed. Not one frame captured the act that 87 people swore they had witnessed clearly. The photos showed Morrison in provocative poses, his hand gesturing toward his groin, his leather pants riding low, his body language aggressive and sexual, but nothing illegal, nothing that constituted public indecency under Florida law. The prosecution argued that Garrett had missed the critical moment, that Morrison's exposure had lasted only seconds, and Garrett's shutter speed hadn't captured it. The defense argued that the photos proved Morrison had never exposed himself, that the incident existed only in the imagination of witnesses predisposed to see Morrison as a criminal. Garrett himself testified that he didn't remember seeing Morrison exposed, but admitted under cross-examination that he had been focused on his camera viewfinder and might have missed it. His testimony satisfied nobody and clarified nothing. The trial began on August 12, 1970, 16 months after the concert. Morrison sat at the defense table wearing a suit, his hair cut short, his beard trimmed, looking nothing like the wild shaman who had commanded the stage at Dinner Key. He was fighting 6 criminal charges: 1 felony count of lewd and lascivious behavior, 1 felony count of public exposure, 2 misdemeanor counts of public profanity, and 2 misdemeanor counts of public drunkenness. If convicted on all counts, he faced up to 3 years in prison and $10,000 in fines. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters, fans, protesters, and curiosity seekers. The trial lasted 3 weeks and produced over 800 pages of testimony. 87 prosecution witnesses testified that Morrison had exposed himself. 200 defense witnesses testified that he had not. Audio recordings from the concert were played and analyzed, but they captured only Morrison's voice and the crowd screaming, nothing visual. The judge, Murray Goodman, grew increasingly frustrated as the trial progressed and the testimony remained hopelessly contradictory. How could so many people witness the same event and report such radically different versions of reality? In his private notes, later released to researchers, Goodman wrote that this was either the most brazen case of perjury he had ever encountered, with one side lying systematically, or it was proof that human perception was fundamentally unreliable, that memory was fiction, and that legal certainty was a comfortable illusion. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned a mixed verdict. Morrison was acquitted on the felony exposure charge. The jury decided that the photographic evidence and the testimonial contradictions created reasonable doubt. But he was convicted on the misdemeanor profanity and simulated exposure charges, sentenced to 6 months hard labor and $500 in fines. Morrison's attorneys immediately filed an appeal. The case would drag through the legal system for another 9 months until Morrison fled to Paris and then died in a bathtub on July 3, 1971, with the appeal still pending. The conviction was never overturned. Technically, Jim Morrison died a convicted criminal. Linda Patterson never returned to Georgia. She called her father from a payphone outside Dinner Key Auditorium 30 minutes after the concert ended and told him she wasn't coming back, that she had witnessed something that convinced her that freedom was worth any price, even if she didn't fully understand what she had witnessed or whether it had actually happened. Her father threatened, begged, threatened again. Linda hung up and disappeared into the Miami night. She worked as a waitress for 2 years, then enrolled at Florida State University, graduated with a degree in sociology, and spent her career working with women escaping abusive relationships. She never married. She attended Morrison's Paris gravesite in 1989 and left a letter under a stone, thanking him for showing her that some cages can only be escaped by refusing to acknowledge their existence. She died in 2017 at the age of 67. Her will left her entire estate to a women's shelter in Tallahassee. The FBI files were declassified in 2003 under Freedom of Information Act requests from researchers studying Morrison's life. The files contained over 600 pages of surveillance reports, witness interviews, and photographic analysis. On page 213, a report filed by FBI Special Agent Donald Pierce included a statement that shocked both the 87 people who swore Morrison had exposed himself and the 200 who swore he had not. Pierce had been in the auditorium that night, positioned in the back of the venue with binoculars and a telephoto lens, assigned to document Morrison's performance as part of the FBI's ongoing monitoring of countercultural figures. His report stated clearly and unambiguously that Morrison had unbuttoned his pants, reached inside, and pulled his genitals partially out of his underwear for approximately 4 seconds, but that the positioning of his leather pants and the angle of the spotlight had created an optical effect where people in certain sections of the auditorium could see his exposed skin clearly, while people in other sections, sometimes standing only feet away, saw only shadows and hand movements. Pierce included a diagram showing sight lines from different audience positions, demonstrating how Morrison's body position and the harsh overhead lighting had created what he called a selective visibility phenomenon. People in sections A, C, and F had clear sight lines to Morrison's exposure. People in sections B, D, E, and G did not. Both groups were telling the truth as they experienced it. Both groups were seeing reality. But they were seeing different realities determined by physics and positioning rather than bias or imagination. The 87 and the 200 had been fighting for 34 years over an optical illusion. Morrison had exposed himself. Morrison had not exposed himself. Both statements were simultaneously true depending on where you stood. The declassification of the FBI files in 2003 should have settled the Miami controversy forever. Instead, it generated new controversies. Conspiracy theorists claimed the FBI report was fabricated to discredit Morrison posthumously. Morrison loyalists argued that partial exposure didn't constitute the full nudity that prosecution witnesses had described under oath. Legal scholars debated whether the FBI report, had it been available during the trial, would have changed the verdict or simply confirmed it. And the question that haunted everyone who studied the case was the simplest and most troubling. If 87 people could sincerely believe they saw something they never fully saw, and 200 people could sincerely believe they didn't see something that partially happened, then what did that reveal about the reliability of human testimony, about the criminal justice system's dependence on eyewitness accounts, about the nature of truth itself? Morrison had always claimed that he was exploring the boundaries between reality and perception, between the observer and the observed, between what exists and what we believe exists. In Miami on March 1st, 1969, whether intentionally or accidentally, he had proven his point in the most dramatic and self-destructive way possible. The incident destroyed his career, ended his freedom to perform in the United States, contributed to his exile in Paris and his death 2 years later. But it also created the perfect Morrison moment: ambiguous, provocative, impossible to definitively resolve, a mystery that revealed more about the people trying to solve it than about Morrison himself. 55 years later, we are still arguing about what happened in those 17 minutes. And Morrison, wherever he is, might be laughing at all of us.